And we appear to be live. Let's just check that people can see us. Hopefully we'll get some comments up that will confirm that people can see us. Yeah, welcome back to the Dictators stream with David DeBatto and myself.
Jonathan, let me tell you something very important, and to our viewers too. I can actually see you and hear you. I hope you can see and hear me, although there seems to be a delay.
I can, absolutely. Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear.
Well, then that's enough. That's all I need to know. I'm going to sign off for now. Just kidding.
Just don't leave me alone. Yeah, I'm not great at ad-libbing, you know.
No, that's okay. As I said, and I have to tell people on my channel, this is the second live stream I've done with you, and the first time that we're trying it simultaneously, both broadcasting it live on your YouTube channel and my YouTube channel. So it's an experiment, and hope it works. We'll see how it goes.
Let's see how it goes. You know, I'm still checking here to see if the audience can actually see me in the way that I can. But there's a lot to discuss, isn't there? We've got Mark Rutte and his extraordinary comments that he's made. We've got the energy war, which is heading into a high gear, and we got the promise of Tomahawks. But they, as far as I can tell, haven't yet made an appearance on the battlefield. What are the key topics for you outside of those?
Oh, there's a bunch of them. You mentioned the Tomahawks. I think off air, we just talked about one of my favorite topics, which is NATO intransigence, meaning dragging their feet. And my all-time favorite person to pick on, which is Mark Rutte, who is the Secretary General of NATO. And a comment that you told me about that I didn't know, which is basically that Mark is suggesting to the West that we shouldn't try to antagonize Russia, that we shouldn't incite them for whatever bizarre reason. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think Mark Rutte is a disgrace. He's not the right person for this job. I'm not quite sure what job he's the right person for, but certainly not to head NATO.
It is. And worse. It's actually worse even than you describe here, David, because his actual comment was, he was asked about what would happen in terms of rules of engagement, not just if. I mean, the questioner asked if, but I think we need to frame it as a when Russian jets overfly NATO territory, not just sort of, along the sort of maritime borders of Estonia, which they did, but what happens when Russian jets overfly NATO territory, air bases, all this kind of stuff, which they inevitably will do. And he came out and said, well, it would be a sign of weakness if we challenged them. It'd be a sign of weakness if we gave a warning and shot them down. That's weakness. No, real strength is ignoring them, letting them pass, letting them continue probing. And he suggested our strategy should be to gently guide them back to their own airspace. I mean, this is not just extraordinary weakness and lack of statesmanship and deterrence and all those things. It seems to me an absolute fundamental misreading of the Russian state mentality, their psychology, and what they are aiming to do with these probes. But you come from a military intelligence background. What's your take on what you've heard there?
Well, I mean, I would like to say just naivete, which it certainly is, but the words cowardice and just stupidity. I mean, I'm sorry, lack of knowledge of Russian and Soviet history, military tactics and strategy. They don't respond well to weakness. They don't respond.
It provokes them. Weakness is a provocation.
Yes. Look, these drone incursions, as well as the MiG overflights into Estonia a while back, these are probes. These are intentional probes sent to gauge NATO's response. It's obvious to anybody except Mark Rutte. And so, no, letting them probe, fly over NATO territory, and then gently guiding them back onto Russian territory is exactly the wrong answer. They need to shoot them the blank down. You can insert your own word in blank. They need to, and not with $1 million missiles. They need to develop their own anti-drone tactics, drones, cheap drones, like Ukrainians have done, and have fleets of them. Look, real quick, I want to say at the very beginning, I find it outrageous, but typical for NATO to say that they're going to be building up their defense industry, their defense budgets, and respond to Russian aggression, but it's going to take 1, 2, 3, 4 years. This is insane. They need to do it now, and they have the capability to do it relatively soon. I'm talking within the next few months at least, to start their economies on a wartime footing, to reopen their defense factories, to enhance their budgets to a wartime footing. They need to respond to Russian aggression now. If they make a move, and one of the things that I've read recently, and I think it's very, very true, is a diversionary attack by Russia. They're not doing very well in Ukraine, contrary to their own propaganda, and a diversionary attack. I'm not talking an armored column, but some armed drones or something else in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, to take away Europe's focus on Ukraine is not out of the question. And right now, Europe is not ready to respond to that. NATO is not ready for that.
And of course, by the response to this probe, which is essentially to let it probe, doesn't this invite not just the next probe, but actually the next escalatory step? So, okay, we've got away with this. So now let's try that. Let's try this. Let's try, maybe an incursion on territory. And we had, we'll go back to sort of another NATO member's response in 2015, which was Turkey, which actually shot a Russian Su-24, I think it was, out of the sky after giving it repeated warnings. That's and hasn't been troubled by incursions since, and it didn't lead to full-scale war. But what we're seeing is the appearance of little green men on the border with Estonia. There's a particular road in a rather odd bit where Russian territory sort of has a little box area which is an incursion into Ukrainian Estonian territory, but a road runs through Estonia and through that little jutting out bit. So-called little green men, 7 unmarked Russian soldiers appeared in a very provocative, threatening move. So what is going to happen then if we allow these probes to continue? Surely the next step is to ratchet it up and probe not just the same stuff all over again, but take an escalatory step, which is what Putin is bound to do.
Of course. I mean, we've seen it in Ukraine. That's Russian tactics 101. They probe, they do as much as they can get away with at the time. And if there's no pushback, they take it a little bit more and a little bit further, and they continue on and on and on. If they do some minor incursions, let's just again say the Baltics, which it seems to be one of the weakest areas, what's to stop them from actually violating the, say, Estonian, not just airspace, but sending a minor, convoy or little green men into Estonia over the Narva Bridge? Because if there's no pushback before that, why shouldn't they? Or any other eastern flank country? Forget Estonia now that I said that. They would respond, even alone. They wouldn't wait for the rest of NATO. But I seriously doubt, and it pains me to say this, Jonathan, that America would not respond. I don't think that Donald Trump would put American forces on the ground or even use our air capabilities to defend what he thinks is a small incursion into NATO countries if it wasn't something that was going to benefit him personally and financially. Horrible, disgraceful thing to say, but I think that Europe has to realize they cannot count on American support for Russian aggression, unless it's just so big, such a huge invasion, such as February 2022 in Ukraine. Other than that, I really fear that America's not going to back up NATO against Russian aggression.
That's the real fear, isn't it? And especially if that would involve vast expenditures, actually physically sending an American armada or force to liberate European territory. At that point, you've got to fear that it would become a fait accompli, which is, okay, we're going to maybe put some sanctions on this. We're going to have some strongly worded things. Maybe we'll have another summit. Yeah, let's go for another summit and talk about it a bit more. All the while, Russia is incrementally digging into European territory and ratcheting up the tension.
Jonathan, I think except for, and I'll carve out some exceptions in my opinion, except for the most of the Baltic countries, specifically Estonia for sure, and possibly Lithuania and Latvia and Poland, except for those nations, I think that most European nations, NATO nations, EU nations would at this point accept, and I hate to say this, accept some minor Russian incursions into their airspace and possibly into their own land territory, violating their territorial integrity. If Putin would come up with some BS story about why he needs to be there to defend Russian territorial integrity or Russian speakers or some other nonsense, I think at this point, except for the countries I just mentioned, that other European countries might swallow that nonsense. And again, I do not think that Donald Trump would send American forces to back them up. I hope I'm wrong, but everything that I've seen and heard and the actions and rhetoric coming from the Trump administration backs up what I'm saying.
That's it. And, even ahead of the Second World War, where we had an American administration that sort of knew that they would take part in the war eventually, they knew which was the side they were, going to come in on, even if not all of the American public were necessarily aligned with that. I mean, one famously recalls the Nazi rally in Madison Square Gardens in the late 1930s. But the administration may be minded to it, but if they cannot take the public along with them, here you've got a sort of curious reversal, haven't you? Because it seems from the latest polls that actually Republicans have started to swing back behind Ukraine. I mean, it's a myth that the Republicans en masse, even MAGA, were rabidly pro-Russia. That's never really been the case. But there seems to have been a swing back towards recognizing who the aggressor is and who the victim is. And even in some of these polls, again done amongst Republicans, it seems there is quite a strong groundswell of support for giving weapons and support to Ukraine. But here we have the guy at the top who is perhaps not even aligned with a majority in his own party on this.
No, I agree. And but here's the thing that we all have to remember. Donald Trump controls the Republican Party, which means he controls both houses of Congress.
And David's slightly frozen there, or I'm slightly frozen. I'm not sure who is frozen. Let's see from the comments if the audience can tell us who is frozen. David's frozen and I'm fine. That means I'm sitting here with dead air. We also have Jason Smart, who is supposed to be joining us in just a second as well. And we're going to dig into some of those issues further. I think with Jason, we're going to talk about Tomahawks and the issues surrounding that. Of course, they've been tentatively promised, but not actually delivered, which I think is going to be rather an interesting. It's going to be rather an interesting situation, whether it's being used to just try to negotiate with Russia, get some kind of leverage, or just create headlines. Now, bear with me for a second. I'm just going to try and get Jason. So for those who've missed the comments by Mark Rutte, it is the most extraordinary demonstration of weakness. The comments suggest that letting Russian incursions and probes pass without challenge, without warning, without reinforcing sovereign borders is actually a sign of strength rather than weakness. And I think we have to look at that in the way in which Russia is going to perceive that. For Russia, it would be a sign of tremendous weakness if, through their physical actions, their physical incursion into European territory, our response is simply words and more words. Words are thought of as weakness in the Russian strategic lexicon, but it seems that is the default amongst NATO, and that is the default amongst European leaders, is to respond with strongly spoken words, and in Rutte's case, to respond with threats that are never going to be followed up on, and to follow with sort of jibes and sarcastic jokes about Russian technical military capabilities. That is not the right way to respond at all. Now we're going to try and get David back in. We're going to try and get Jason in as well. If you just give me a couple of seconds to try and do that. We are definitely having some technical difficulties here today. Right, while we try to do that, let's have a theory. The Tomahawks are not so important in themselves. I'd love to add the comment to the screen. I don't have permission at this point, but this is a great question from Mads. I have a theory. The Tomahawks are not really so important in themselves, like the Abrams, which allowed Germany to provide their tanks. The Tomahawks will open the door for Taurus missiles. I'm not so sure about that. I think certainly Ukraine has developed its own capabilities, and the Tomahawks are in addition to that, which is great. You know, having both those capabilities are good. The Tomahawks have a longer range. I believe the amended ones can have a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. That brings a lot more strategic targets into the potential orbit of Ukraine. Further than the Flamingos and other capabilities would currently allow. So I think that is certainly significant. I'll match your theory with a theory here that, of course, Tomahawks are not a silver bullet, but they are an important capability to add to Ukraine's armory, you know, especially at this time. We've got David back here as well. Apparently Jason's ready. You can add Jason if you can see him in your
I can see
studio
him.
window.
I
There's
have
Mr.
to everyone. I got a text on Telegram from the Kremlin, and the FSB's been meddling here, and so I hope that I can block them. I put in some new
hacked your
anti-FSB software, and I think we've solved that problem.
I was talking about Tomahawks, so this is a great introduction here to Jason.
Good to see you guys.
And there's various comments here in the chat. You know, is this just a negotiation point? Are Tomahawks symbolic? Will they unlock the provision of Taurus? Will they make a strategic, difference, etc.? So there's quite a bit of debate sort of going on here, and as to whether Trump is simply using this as a kind of carrot to dangle in front of a carrot/stick for Putin to engage in the next round of pointless peace talks. I will stop talking, as I have been, to dead air for 10 minutes. I'll let you jump in.
Go for it, David. What do you think?
As far as the Tomahawks, I think that obviously Zelensky's very serious about this. This is a golden opportunity for him to try to make Trump do something that he really doesn't give a shit about, which is Ukraine. But let me answer the question. Whether or not Tomahawks ever actually make it to Ukraine right now is still debatable. The Congress the Senate, not the entire U.S. House, just passed the continuing resolution for the defense budget, which includes the Tomahawks for Ukraine. However, that's just the Senate. It has to go back to the House now, where they're going to debate it, and it may or may not stay in the final bill that's eventually passed, because as many people know, our government shut down right now. And one major impasse is because of the Democrats wanting health provisions put in the government for poorer people. If the Democrats refuse to budge on that, then this whole Tomahawks thing may go away. So it's even debatable whether or not the Tomahawks are going to make it to Ukraine, number one. Number two, if they do make it to Ukraine, again, it's not going to be because Trump really gives a damn. But if they do make it there, then the question becomes, and Jason, you can follow up with me, of course, on this, whether or not the Americans, the Pentagon, the Trump administration is going to allow the Ukrainians to use the longer ranged Tomahawks to reach any targets that they deem necessary for their own defense. They may control the targets that the Ukrainians use with the Tomahawks if they are provided. They may just maintain control over it. So, number one, I don't know if the Tomahawks are going to make it there. If they do, I don't know whether the Americans are going to keep the Ukrainians on a really tight leash in terms of targeting inside of Russia.
Well, I think it's less about the Tomahawks themselves. Of course, it's an interesting development. But I think perhaps more interesting is what other things they might be considering, especially with intelligence gathering or intelligence sharing in this case. Because ultimately, you're right. It's about what they allow them to shoot. I don't think that it's really, though, about that. I think Tomahawks are not the first time during this war where there's been a lot of focus on something like F-16s, which I think was okay. It's good that people keep focus on that, but it's a brand. But it's more than the brand. It's about how the U.S. is going to see this going forward. Are they going to give Russia the capacity? Sorry. Give Ukraine the capacity to strike within Russia, to do what's necessary to defeat Russia? Or are they going to continue hamstringing Ukraine, as the U.S. has done so far for 3.5 years, and not allow it to do what's necessary to topple the Putin regime? And I think that's actually the fundamental. How that's done, the specific tools that are given, if it's a Tomahawk or elsewise, I think is less important than has there been a change in strategy, a change in objectives, because that's really what's going to make a difference for the future of Ukraine. Jonathan, David, someone?
Well, again, I had some technical difficulties. I had to wrestle somebody off my line here. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but to me, it comes back to the fact that I don't know what the final result's going to be as far as, look, the Americans supplying any new weapons of substance or support for Ukraine at all. And I'm sorry, that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, even not just with Ukraine, but with Europe as well. What are the Americans going to do? Are they going to supply, as you said, Jason, intelligence? Are they going to continue or restore the intelligence gathering with Ukraine, because they can supply them with all the weapons in the world, but if they don't have the ability to accurately target them using intelligence that only America at this point can provide, then they're almost useless. But let's assume that they do provide them with the intelligence they need, the capabilities, the intelligence capabilities they need to target anywhere in Russia that they would like. If they say, yes, but you can only target A, B, and C, and it's going to have to be with our permission, and that's really going to handcuff Ukraine. And sure, they're going to accept it because it's better than nothing. But I hope that's not what happens if they, in fact, ever do supply Ukraine with the Tomahawks.
Well, as I said, I think the Tomahawks are sort of a secondary issue. It's more what you said. The primary issue is, what is the position of the U.S. going to be? I think it's definitely the more interesting question here. And if the U.S. is serious about allowing Ukraine to win, or if it's not made the decision yet, based upon that, I think that everything else is sort of secondary. Because ultimately, even if they gave Tomahawks a restricted usage, then really what good was it? So really the question we should be asking is, will the U.S. be doing what's necessary to not only allow Ukraine to win, but to facilitate its winning by doing things such as attacking deep inside of Russia, going after the power grids, going after things such as the critical parts of their country's economy that allow it to function. And the Russian economy really is in a disastrous state. I was just reading, I should have a video coming out in a couple hours about this, but I was just reading some statistics earlier today about this. Sorry, I'm losing my voice again. And one of the most fascinating things I've read is how much Russian banks are losing right now. So month over month, banks are losing hundreds of billions of rubles are being taken out. It's a significant amount. I mean, it was 137 billion just the first part of this month, 188 billion last month, 199 billion the month before, 226 billion the month before that, 216 billion before the month before that. And you go through it and you say, that's strange. That's a lot of money leaving the banks. You see the fact that there's the stock market in Russia has really started to bottom out. The fact that they're giving such huge discounts right now on things like euros as well as on Brent, the discounts that they're forced to give for the oil markets is significant. I mean, they're taking a real haircut with that. All these different things are signs that Russia's economic capacity to continue fighting is being diminished. Now, how the White House is going to treat that is going to be something where it tries to hurry that up or try to, hasten the decline of Putin remains to be seen. Obviously, we hope that's the case, but that does remain to be seen. I think that generally speaking, I've become more optimistic, not less, in the recent times. I was just in Washington, D.C., and I was there for a number of meetings that were very, very interesting. And the reason that I have more faith now than before was simply speaking to people who would be in the know about such things, including people who work for major U.S. news organizations who cover the White House. The fact is that there's been some sort of a change in the White House. They're fed up with Putin, mostly because of the Nobel Peace Prize thing, that he wasn't going along with ending the war. That really upset them. And I'm not going to say that the president's petty, but we all know he's very petty. So I think that this is enough to motivate him. I mean, I would not exclude it. Would a 5-year-old behave this way? Yeah, probably. So would I give that to Trump? Probably. Yeah, I could believe he would do that. That sounds about right.
Well, Jason, I think you're absolutely right, but it's really sad that the Western world, especially Ukraine, has to that their fate may hinge on what a 5-year-old would do, what an immature man with a very thin skin will do. The fact that he's probably very upset and angered about Putin dissing him after Alaska and continuing to pummel Ukraine when he promised him that he wouldn't, that Donnie, we're best forever friends. And in that, he turns out that that's not true, that this immature child of a president may use that to actually do the right thing, which is to supply Ukraine with the intelligence, most importantly, and the weapons they need to drive Russia out of their country. It's really sad and ironic in a way, but you know what? I don't care what it takes. If that's what it takes to get America to supply Ukraine with all that they need to win this war, I'm all for it.
And that's a case I made last year before Trump's election was confirmed, that if he gets in, and I think I had a pretty good idea that he would, that he might accidentally or incidentally do the right thing.
Yes.
Another one of those things, of course, and we'll come to Taurus, because I doubt very much whether the supply of Tomahawks would actually unlock the Taurus capability, because I'm really not sure. Europe is in the right place, and we'll come back to Mark Rutte in a minute and get Jason Smart's view on that. Yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought there. What was I going to say? I have no idea.
Well, you're going to say that Donald Trump is like a broken clock. He's right.
A broken clock.
He's right.
Yeah.
Twice a day.
And the other one was oil. That was the question.
Yeah.
The same thing in oil. The one thing that really could hold Putin's war machine to account is a massive drop in the global oil price. That could really wreck his economy, as it helped to wreck the Soviet Union before it, push it over the edge. Are we seeing any signs that there's a concerted effort to drop global oil prices? I saw some sort of hints coming out. I think it was from the Kiev Independent earlier today along those lines, or maybe the Kiev Post.
Jason, what do you have to say about that? What about the shadow fleet? What about the secondary sanctions? Do you see on your end any movement to do, as Jonathan said, to finally really cut off Russians' ability to sell their oil and gas?
Well, that is a good question. The fact is that we obviously have the ability and the right and the responsibility to stop all the oil tankers, because they're in violation of the sanctions, but they're also in violation of I mean, all the maritime laws. I mean, they don't have insurance. They're not following the safety regulations. They don't have trained crews. They are a natural disaster, Exxon Valdez, waiting to happen. So it'd be the correct thing to stop them, if nothing else, because it's in our own interest. Forget the sanctions, just because it is actually a floating disaster waiting to happen. We should have an interest in seeing that not happen, especially when you consider that some of these ships are in areas that are not so far away. I mean, those waves will eventually reach the shores that we live on. So we don't really want to see these sorts of natural disasters. And the only way to prevent that is to stop the ships. But it's a good question as to why we have not done it. We do have the
Well, you
physical
can actually
capacity.
see it from the Danish coast. I was there, and we saw in the summer holiday, we saw a grey fleet vessel pass under one of those bridges linking the islands. These things are meters away from shorelines, not miles away.
Well, that's the absurdity. Is you saw that when the French finally, there was an interdiction of the one ship because it was the one who had the drones had been coming off of it to fly over what was it, the airports. And what's surprising about that is simply that they all knew it came from there. It wasn't hard to get to. It wasn't hard to board the ship or anything. But the fact is, they had to wait for this when it's physically attacking a European country. We allowed it to be there. We knew that it had the inherent risk. There was a high potential they could carry out attacks from it, and nobody cared. I mean, nobody stopped them. And to me, that's just fascinating. I mean, why not? The other thing is that, historically, I know that the Ukrainians have desired or aimed to sink part of this fleet. When it was empty, though, specifically when it was empty, because they wouldn't upset the Europeans that they were creating environmental hazard by sinking something with oil that would pour out everywhere. But as a whole, it baffles my mind that we haven't gone after it. And actually, very sincerely, I don't understand the logic for it, because if you look at like where it's going, these are countries. In the case of India, as you know, most of the oil that they buy is not being used for domestic use. It's not because they have a huge population. They're forced into this corner, and there's no other way they can support themselves. No, they're reselling this stuff. This is for pure economic gain of some very rich people. That's all it is. So why aren't we stopping it? It's very hard for me to understand.
Well, let me throw this out there for the folks that are watching and hopefully commenting. And I just talked to Chuck Farr about this. I just interviewed him before this, and he said we talked about the same thing. And his opinion was that it's a lack of political will. I mean, that's not a mystery, but it's because the majority, I guess, of the European leaders are still afraid of antagonizing Putin, that they feel if they interdict these ghost ships without way beyond enough reason, probable cause, violation of international law, and so forth and so on, it's going to antagonize him further. But you made all the right points, Jonathan, about violation, Jason, about violation of international law, the environmental costs. Russia only has very few warm weather ports. And they need to go out of, for example, in the Baltics, they need to go through the Baltic Sea. They need to go out of the St. Petersburg area, through the Baltic area. There's no reason on earth why NATO, even the Baltics, but NATO cannot just interdict any ships that are obviously in violation, that are not seaworthy, that are an environmental disaster, and just interdict them, search them. If they find drones, if they find anything, oil, if they find anything in contravention of sanction policies or further international law, seize the ship, seize the crew, seize the contraband, and call it a day. It's all coming down to political will. And unless and until NATO and the EU decides to get serious with these sanctions, the secondary sanctions and the shadow fleet, Russia is going to continue to be able to fund the war against Ukraine. And that's just a disgrace and unforgivable, in my opinion. And I like to know what the viewers think about that. As well as Jason and Jonathan.
Absolutely.
So, Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I stunned you into silence, which is not unusual for me. So, I mean, talking to really. Go ahead. No, please.
Talking to experts, even someone like Elizabeth Braw, she says that this is an area fraught with danger, and the fact that there is no legal authority to necessarily impound ships of a foreign power in the high waters. Even if they're breaking various things, or at least, what I think we see here is a common pattern, which is where there's area of ambiguity, where there's legalistic arguments or administrative arguments, we are always falling on the side of caution, always falling on the side of using these administrative, arguments to prevent giving decisive deterrence action. It was until recently the same thing on the frozen Russian assets, and letting sort of Belgium and Euroclear basically say, okay, we're just not going to, take those risks on, and use these little tiny sort of bureaucratic points. Unfortunately, those things seem to me to signal to Russia weakness. It signals to Russia that they can carry on ratcheting up escalation. It's the same, unfortunately, with the drones. It's saying, well, we don't have the authority to do this, or it's better not to touch them. That kind of leads us into, the comments of Mark Rutte. What we're doing here is signaling our so-called adherence to law, administrative codes, this, that, and the other, certain ways of doing things. All we're doing is signaling to Russia that they can carry on, and they can escalate, and they can keep punching us, but actually punch us harder and harder each time.
Jonathan, let me say this.
Jason.
Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there is no legal authority to interdict these ships, which I don't agree with. But let's just say, again, for the sake of argument, that NATO, the EU, the West doesn't have any legal authority to interdict these shadow fleet ships. What about if they do anyway? What is Russia going to do? Sue us? Take us to court? Okay, that's fine. Maybe they'll start a war. No, they've already done that. It's called Ukraine. This is stupid. This is crazy. This is going to taking a knife to a gunfight. This is the Democrats in America using a subpoena to hit the Republicans over the head. Doesn't work.
It's not even a knife. I would welcome a knife at this point. We're taking a spoon to a gunfight. That's the level, we're at, I think.
Well, I hate to break it to people, but we're at war. There is a war in Ukraine. Russia has stated for years, Jason, you can clarify how many years, that they are at war with the West. The problem is the West hasn't admitted or acknowledged that they are at war yet. That's a problem.
No, I agree with you totally. I mean, I think that's always the question, though, right? Is that it's not what we want, it's what they want that matters in this situation. And I think most people don't choose to have their houses robbed until the robber determines he's going to rob your house. So it doesn't matter what you say to him or what you try to propagate. He's already made a decision about your future for you. In the same way that there is a decision to wage war, it's not something that's really in our hands. It's a decision that was being made by somebody else for us. And in this case, it was being made by the Soviet Union, actually, going back, way back in the beginning of the Soviet Union, where it's part of Soviet state policy. I mean, eventually there's going to be a survival of the communist system where socialism will spread globally, and the basis for that will be the Soviet Union. And so the defeat of the West would be part of what was necessary to achieve that ends. But today, nothing's changed. They view that there's going to be sort of they say they don't want a bipolar world, which is just false. They do. I mean, they sort of want unipolar world. But the way that they would organize that is simply by making sure that the West is defeated and unable to compete anymore with them. And that's really what it boils down to. So if we understand that's what the real objectives are and what they're going for, it makes it even more absurd that we always try to give them a lifeline and buy more time for them to restabilize and get back on their feet. History has shown that it doesn't really work out well for us. They're not interested in being our partners. They're not interested in being our friends. They're interested in seeing our downfall. And so it sort of seems systemically flawed to think about what we should do next and always find a solution that says, and we'll work together, when there's perhaps a chance that they don't want to work together. We don't ask them that. We don't look at their state policies and what they're doing to actively work against us, which would be indicative of the fact that though they say one thing, what they do is quite a bit different. And what they do is so much stronger, so much more clear than their empty words that Moscow typically gives us. But what do you think?
Well, I went to an event where, and it was framed as a debate. I think, obviously these appeal to the public, but I think they have limited efficacy. But here you had two people arguing that sanctions should not be a tool of foreign policy because they've comprehensively failed, and two people who are arguing that they should. So those arguing that sanctions are essential, even if they're flawed, were Edward Lucas and Tom Kimmage, who's a well-known sort of Chatham House expert and very strong voice on the financial kind of side. And they were arguing actually against a former British ambassador and a diplomat, and the guy who was in the Moscow embassy, who actually, by his admission, was the architect of half the sanctions, or at least he was asked to implement half the sanctions or approve them. And he made the case of how ineffective they are, and we should just abandon it as a tool. And some arguments come out of this, which are extraordinary, examples, I would say, of almost reflexive control. One is this sort of West blaming itself, and this is a particularly sort of diplomatic failing, that somehow Russia's aggression now is ultimately the fault of the West. That somehow we didn't engage enough with them in the 90s, that we didn't support their, democratic transition, etc., etc., etc. This sort of self-loathing that somehow leads to giving Russia an excuse, get them off the hook. The other arguments there that sanctions have done more harm to us than it's done to Russia, which from all your reports, Jason, is patently untrue. And Edward made the interesting assertion there. If the sanctions don't work, why do Russian oligarchs spend literally millions of dollars a year to highly paid lawyers to help them avoid those self-same sanctions? I mean, a completely ludicrous argument. But there seems to be a strain of weakness and self-loathing and fear of projecting power and deterrence while letting Russia off the hook for its genocidal imperial activity over and over and over.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a sort of absurdity of what's going on. The fact is that the Russian oligarchs are obviously being affected by this. They're obviously being damaged by this, and we all know it. We all see it. And the fact is that the Kremlin itself is obviously keen to see the sanctions taken off. It is pivotal to seeing the decline of their economy. And just keep in mind, I think the most important thing about, it's very hard to say the most important thing, but I think amongst the things that's very important with the sanctions is simply the fact that so much of Russia throughout the 90s, 2000s, when the country is especially impoverished, the Soviet Union stopped existing. So that meant the development or even the maintenance of things like farm technologies or even factories, the way that they worked, it just dissipated. It wasn't like they kept up with the science of this or they're trying to improve it. They just sort of let it fall by the wayside. And as a result, today, many of the factories just became cheaper and more efficient, bought Western-made goods. But now that the Western-made goods are harder to get and harder to import, that makes everything much more complicated. Their entire industrial base is based on it. Look at the factories specifically that deal with things like bread. Look at the ones who are producing things such as the refineries. The refineries, we know a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, and not all of the refinery, but specific parts of it are using parts that come from the West. And so when those are destroyed, it has something that has a trickle-down effect on everything else. Everyone else who's involved in the refining business, whether it's the guy who's transporting it there or the guy who's then distributing it around the country, is affected de facto by the fact that just that one specific node within the larger refinery that was made with Western goods, which cannot easily be replaced, was destroyed. And look at the airline industry of Russia. You know that no airline in Russia today has airworthiness for its airplanes in the sense that it does not have what is necessary to fly over Europe because they don't have the maintenance necessary. Where are they going to get the parts from? Where are you going to get the Airbus parts from? Where are you going to get the Boeing parts from if you can't buy them legally? If you're doing smugglers, how can you then justify your airworthiness certificates, the airplane's in good shape, if in fact you can't show where you got this parts from? There's a lot of problems that Russia has. And these are just very small ones. They're the first ones that come to mind. But if we look at it, it is, once again, a systemic, a cascading problems that they're having, not just one-offs. What do you think, David?
Well, I think one thing that we haven't said exactly, but we've been dancing around it, is that whenever you let the other side, in this case Russia, control the narrative, you lose. And we've lost, meaning we don't control the narrative. Since this war began, going back to 2014 or maybe before, we have allowed, meaning the West has allowed Russia to control the narrative. And with the current administration closing down most of the agencies in the United States that fight the narrative, meaning the cyber agencies, the counter-espionage agencies, our intelligence agencies that work to defeat disinformation in the United States, with those going away or being rapidly depleted of personnel and budgets, Russia is going to be able to control the narrative even more than they do now. And again, I can talk about, of course, America, my country, and most people don't get it at all. They firmly believe that Russia is winning the war. They believe the majority of the lies that come out of the Kremlin, because a lot of them here are echoed by right-wing media. And so they believe it must be true. So we have allowed, and this goes back to the Biden administration. I'm not going to put this on the Trump administration, as much as I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump. This goes way back, even before Biden, but certainly the Biden administration and now the Trump administration. We are allowing, hands down, the Russians to control the narrative, not just about Ukraine, but as you said, Jason, about poor us, how Russia's the victim, how they have to do this, and that it's the West's fault, it's NATO's fault, it's EU's fault, the eternal Russian victimhood, which goes back hundreds of years and which is still playing out now in a theater near you. We believe that because the Russians control the narrative. Until that stops, until we, the West, take back the narrative, meaning we need to tell our story, the truth, to the citizens of the West, Russia's going to win. Maybe not this war, but they're going to win the hearts and minds of far too many people in the West. And we're seeing that in the elections in Europe. We're seeing the right wing, the far right extremists gain more and more ground in Europe because Russia's controlling the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that Russia has undue influence. We consider a small country it is. I mean, GDP smaller than Italy's. How much global influence does Italy have versus Russia? It's pretty large difference, right? But I would say that the Russians, they're not limited only to the right. I mean, they are pretty well spread out, pretty well invested. They're equal opportunity. I think they were happy to use anyone they can to advance their cause, which is to fracture societies. There's something actually I'm researching about this now, which I don't mean to be boring about, but I think is, well, hell, I'll tell you because it's just sort of interesting. So the other day, somebody wrote to me and said, "Do you know that there's, I don't know, a dozen or dozen and a half different TikTok accounts attributable to my name?" And I did not know that. And they said, "Did you see all the rest of the YouTube channels?" Which I had not seen either. And so what it turns out to be is that these TikTok accounts, many of them have tens of thousands of subscribers. There's dozens of them. And what's interesting about it is that they're popping up and they're populating with different things. And so I have some friends that study these sorts of things, how messages spread and how propaganda is used. And what's funny about it is I presume because Ukraine is associated more with being a lefty issue, that it's the target audience that they're going for is definitely center left or left. Because the different things that we try to find that they have in common was that at the end, they're all promoting various let's say public figures or people, none of whom I'd ever heard of before, but are very popular with some people on the left that are especially anti-establishment, very much so against the state being involved in foreign conflicts or foreign wars. And so we don't know exactly where this is going yet. We'll get to it in a few days. But what's interesting about it is that why this? Why are they promoting these sorts of people who are some random Americans, comedians included, that have these viewpoints? Well, because ultimately I don't think they really care about this comedian or anything else. It just, they realize pushing this narrative that the U.S. is too overextended in foreign countries, that should let those countries be alone, is something that countries like Russia have an interest in promoting. And so that's something that they're using widely. And that's not uncommon. I mean, the fact is that Russia has been involved with, choose a cause where it will probably divide the society, Russia will get involved in. And it's quite literally any issue. I mean, once again, the objective here is not actually to promote a political cause, as much as is to reflexive control, as Jonathan said, to create this response in the enemy population, so that population is no longer be a threat to you and will be doing things that are aligned with what is your state's interest, in this case, things that will help Russia and hurt the West. And the way that they organize it is very well researched. Obviously, they've spent now several decades working on this, and by comparison, Western countries simply don't operate this way, unfortunately. And so there's a lot less appreciation, I think, we have for it, of how much effort they put into this and how well developed it really is.
Jason, what do you make of the widespread Russian chaos? What you're talking about that's been spread out through Europe, the arsons, the murders, the disruptions, the drone incursions, the airports being shut down, the disinformation, the election meddling. Where do you see this going, and why is Europe, the leaders, putting up with this? Why is this still not a five-alarm fire for them? Why are they allowing this to continue?
It's a really good question, and I think there's two answers to it. Is one is that they obviously fear this escalation as always, but the other aspect of it, I think, is that there probably are things that happen, and they're happening behind the scenes. I think there's a lot that happens. For instance, Russia doesn't admit that it's doing this. We're the ones that publish it. They probably are attacked as well, but they choose not to publish it. That's also a decision. So we don't know exactly what's going on there. But there are some signs that probably they do face some sorts of pressures that we decide to put on them. Unfortunately, it's not enough, and it's obviously not enough to deter them. But I think one of the most fascinating reports I've ever read in my entire life was going back to the 2016 U.S. elections, U.S. presidential elections. There was a report, and now I'm going to forget whose it was. I want to say it was the House. It was a select committee. But either way, it doesn't make a difference. What the bottom line was, though, this U.S. intelligence report that came out, which was published, came out and it said something fascinating, which was talking about how the hacking was being done by Russians. And when I read that, which when I find the document, I'll send it to you because now I can't remember the name. It's going to kill me. Is it was absolutely amazing. I mean, it says, Ivan Ivanovich showed up at the office and it was 8:49 a.m. He walked in door number 3. He used his passcode. Then he walked to his computer. He unlocked the door using this code. They sat down at his desk using this code. Then he sat down. He went this. Then he went to the other room. He got a cup of coffee. He talked with Alexander Alexeyevich. And he did this. And then he came back to his room and he sat down. He logged back into his computer. And when I read this, I was like, what's really amazing about this report is less the fact that how detailed it is, but the fact that they're showing off if we have this degree of intelligence about how your hackers operate, where obviously we know that means the U.S. has had access to their cameras because we know who he interacted with or who he passed in the hallway. There's no other way you can know that unless you saw it. We know what his passcodes were. We know what he was logging into. We know what time he came, what time he left. We know what emails he sent in that period of time. I think that our degree of penetration of them is so much more superior than what they have of us. That's part of the reason as well.
But Jason, do you think that exists now with all of the drastic cuts and budget cuts in the United States and our cyber attack, or offensive and defensive cyber agencies and offices, the ones specifically that targeted Russia being shut down? Do we still have that level of penetration?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that there's it's a very good question. I don't know. I don't understand by any means the logic of closing down all the cyber stuff. To me, that is truly incomprehensible. But all the same, it's incomprehensible. I don't know how we can try to justify why that would be wise. If you look at how small of a budget it is to have cybersecurity for your country, why would you cut that?
Not only that, but the offices that combated Russian disinformation in general were also closed down, along with the cyber offices that targeted Russia.
That is true. No, it's tragic. I don't know what's going on there, but I will say that it does not look good from the outside.
No, and it's probably worse on the inside. It keeps me up at night. This is just incredible. I don't know who thinks that this is a good thing. I don't know what the upside is to that for American national security. I think nothing. All I can think is that there's some financial motive to that. There always is. I just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, it's totally possible.
And the other report, we've got two things, which I think in the few minutes we got left. One is the energy war. And of course, it is concerning, how Russia is systematically taking out, let's say, Ukraine's gas reserves and its gas infrastructure, and also targeting energy, although I understand that a lot of the energy supply has been sort of decentralized over the last couple of years. So it won't, the lights won't go out completely. But how's this winter shaping up? And is this, dare I say, a final attritional battle to see who can degrade the other side's sort of energy infrastructure and resource base when it comes to energy as revenue for building their respective war machines?
Well, I hope Jason jumps in here, and I'm sure he will. Let me just say one thing, that as always, Russia targets primarily the civilian sector. They're hoping to cause as much pain and misery to the Ukrainian population as they can this winter. Whereas, for the most part, the Ukrainians are targeting the military industrial complex. They are trying to cut the gas and oil infrastructure so that Russia cannot resupply its military. Again, two opposites here, and I don't think the majority of the world knows that, or at least differentiates between those two strategies.
And that's certainly held for most of the war. There are some interesting little hints that there's some slight changes here. One is, of course, the strike on the Belgorod thermal power plant twice. Now, one can say that it's dual use. A lot of these facilities, almost everything in Russia is dual use because the military is so endemic. But what we don't hear about, of course, is Russian successes in hitting Ukrainian military-industrial complex, because quite rightly, they don't talk about that stuff. So yes, we hear the civilian stuff. We don't necessarily hear whether there are successful strikes against military-industrial targets.
I mean, there are obviously.
Jason, please.
They're not 100% blind. They do sometimes hit targets, but they I think that it's one of the things that is also challenging is that the Russians aren't very precise in their weaponry, and so there does seem to be a lot of times where things do strike civilian targets, or I mean, for that matter, where air defense will hit a missile, and the missile still has to come down somehow, and then it explodes. And sometimes that is, in residential areas as well. So there's a lot of different things that can happen, not just, the obvious, clear targeting of civilian targets, but the fact that there's other ways that things do end up being struck. But going ahead, I think that the Russians as a whole are very keen to figure out how it is that they can create a change. At this point, I think that they themselves sense that things are not going the way that they should. Things are quite obviously not going the way that they should on the battlefield. Economically, politically, socially, there's nothing really good going on in Russia. And I mean that quite objectively. I mean, I'm quite serious. Is that, I do read the Russian news every day. I follow it pretty carefully. Talk to lots of other people who study Russia carefully. And when you look at it all, there is a lot of signs coming out of the country that it's just not a sustainable situation. It's not tenable. And as such, it's going to eventually reach a head. It's going to reach a breaking point. And given the current economic situation, as rapidly is worsening in Russia, to such a large degree, so much more than I would have ever guessed 5 years ago was possible. I think that there's a really good chance that we could see destabilizing events in the near term.
I certainly hope you're right. I think that the reports of Putin's demise in the past, of course, have been greatly exaggerated because everybody wants to see him go. But I agree with you, Jason. Everything that I see, read, and hear from people inside of Russia, he's not as popular as he was, and if anything else, the oligarchs are getting very, very antsy. He's not going to be taken down by the Russian population, but when it happens, it's either going to be the security forces and or the oligarchs, and I don't know how close that is to happening. I hope it's very soon.
We can always hope it's going to be even sooner, guys. Though it was great talking. I've got to run, unfortunately. I apologize, but it's good to see you.
Thanks, Jason.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Great to see you. And this is probably where we need to wrap up anyway, isn't it, David? Because we didn't come to a conclusion on Tomahawks. I know Jason is of the view that they're on their way, but you never know from one day to the other whether Trump is going to withdraw or not.
Something we didn't get into now, and maybe for future future episodes, is the continuing or expanding ability of Russia in the UK. How they are making inroads into not European, but British politics. Not overwhelming, but more and more. I think
it's dangerous.
The right-wing extremists are listening to the Kremlin more and more. So I would like to talk about that in the future.
It's a dangerous situation, and I know you talk about being shadow banned a lot, and I don't necessarily have your same experience of shadow banning. But for instance, I put a video out on Monday, and it got 40,000 views, and that was on a Ukraine topic, which is great. I put out what I thought was one of my best videos, and I put a huge amount of work into the structure and scripting on Nigel Farage. I had the image of Nigel Farage. I put it out yesterday with the implication that somehow his interests lie more with foreign powers than they do with us. That video got a couple of hundred views. So I'm like, and when I looked at the stats, it was deeply, deeply weird. The way it just that video just died almost instantly, whereas all other variables are the same. Usually you'd expect a thumbnail like that to do reasonably well. You'd expect the topic to do well. You'd expect not maybe 40,000, which the previous video got on a Ukraine topic, but you'd expect it to get at least a couple of thousand. Just a handful of few. It died. So I'm concerned.
Before we go, because you brought up shadow banning, I just wanted to say to the viewers that YouTube is shadow banning the hell out of me. And so it doesn't matter what I do, what I say, what the thumbnails say. If they don't like it, which they generally don't now, they are shadow banning the hell out of me, and very few people get to see it. So for those of you watching, please go over to the No Delusion Zone at YouTube and become a subscriber. You can also buy me a coffee at No Delusion Zone. I know a lot of folks do that for Jonathan, and they should. But please consider supporting my channel, because it's rough with YouTube. They're Kremlin overlords and they're MAGA overlords really take a dim view of what I'm saying, and they don't allow most people to see my videos, even if they do subscribe. So let's subscribe the hell out of my channel and see what happens.
Absolutely, we need these voices now more than ever. Well, for today, thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for the brilliant comments. We haven't got to all the comments, mainly because of our sort of general technical issues, and then we had Jason's voice we wanted to focus on. But there's some brilliant comments in there. Hopefully those get preserved and transferred over and remain with the video. People can access them. For now, though, that's it. End of the stream. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Jonathan, and viewers.
If you hit the end stream button, I think it should cut off any second now.